All right, good evening, and welcome to tonight's conversation with Darrell West on the future of work, robots, AI, and automation. As you know, Darrell is the Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. I'm Susan Moffett. I'm the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy here at the Watson Institute at Brown. So glad to have you all here with us tonight. And we're very glad to have Darrell West back. Before Brookings Institution got him, he was the chair of the Political Science Department here at Brown and the director of the Taubman Center. Welcome back, Darrell. As you know, he is an expert in the field that we are talking about tonight. The Taubman Center focuses its research and its program on three themes: the cost of living, the value of democracy, and the price of security. And Darrell's work really speaks to the intersection of all of these themes. Darrell is a prolific writer. He is the author of 24 books, which includes the one he is discussing tonight, The Future of Work. I will not list them all, but he even has a more recent book just out called Divided Politics, Divided Nation, Hyper-Conflict in the Trump Era. Another one of his classics is Digital Government, Technology, and Public Sector Performance, which won the Don K. Price Award for the best book in technology for the American Political Science Association. He's also the author of 36 articles. I'm glad he's here to share his expertise with us tonight. The center that Darrell runs at the Brookings Institution examines a wide range of topics related to technology innovation, including governance, democracy, and public sector innovation. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you come back often and again soon. So our time together is going to unfold in the following way. Darrell will begin with about 30 minutes of conversation with us on the future of work, and then he and I will engage in conversation for about another 15 minutes, and then we will open up the floor to your questions. We very much look forward to your questions. Please be aware that our event this evening is being recorded, and that includes the question and answer time. And then we can continue our conversation out in the Agora afterwards for a reception with Darrell. Now, will you please join me in very warmly welcoming Darrell West.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that kind introduction. And she mentioned my most recent book, Divided Politics, which just came out 2 weeks ago. So it's literally hot off the press. It is a family memoir about political polarization in America, because I grew up on a dairy farm in rural Ohio, so obviously a very conservative community, and then taught for 26 years at Brown University, which you know is a liberal institution. So I've lived among both conservative and liberal tribes. And my immediate family reflects America's divisions in the sense that my two sisters stayed in the rural community, married local farmers, are Christian fundamentalists, and they love Donald Trump. And my brother and I are more liberal. We're not quite as enamored with President Trump. So you can imagine how family reunions go over well. So the book basically reflects 40 years of conversations we've had about American politics. But it's great to be back at Brown. I've been gone about 11 years now. There are lots of positive changes here, many things going on in DC as well. The presidential campaign is underway. We have a very big field. I think there are more than 15 candidates on the Democratic side who have announced already. Several older candidates, and of course, everybody's waiting for Joe Biden to announce. We're expecting him to announce in the next 2 weeks. Just recently, Biden was asked that perennial question on whether he wore boxers or briefs. And we all remember that question from many years ago. And his answer was, depends. So a sad commentary on our national dialogue. But tonight, I want to talk about my book, The Future of Work, Robots, AI, and Automation. And in the book, I argue that the technology revolution is really accelerating. And I think people are going to be genuinely shocked how rapidly many of the changes take place. I mean, just consider the following things. Like, I have gone to restaurants recently where you walk in and I've been handed a tablet and I order off of the tablet as opposed to from a waiter or waitress. Amazon already has opened several retail stores without any clerks in them. Basically, you download the Amazon app, you walk in through a turnstile and they register who you are. You go shopping, you walk out through the turnstile. The turnstile reads the tags on the items that you're removing, and it automatically charges your credit card or your mobile payment system. So you leave the store with all the items without dealing with any human clerks. Autonomous vehicles are appearing on the streets of major American cities in many places around the country. Ford just announced it is doing pilot testing in Washington, D.C. I can hardly wait until those cars hit the DC traffic circles. I think that's going to be an incredible challenge for those vehicles. AI is becoming ubiquitous in finance, healthcare, education, and e commerce. And of course, robots are becoming very prevalent in the manufacturing sector. The New York Times actually ran a cartoon recently which featured a factory floor with a few human beings monitoring the control panels and a bunch of robots on the floor. And basically, the robots were doing all the work. And so the big question that everybody's asking is just what is all this going to mean? How's it going to affect society? What's going to be the impact on the workforce? Are robots going to take your jobs? Now, those of you who are Brown University students and are about to graduate, don't worry. Like you're getting the best education in the world. You're going to do just fine. Some of your fellow people around the country may not fare quite as well. Larry Summers, the famous Harvard economist, has predicted that by 2050, one third of prime age men between the ages of 25 and 54 will not be working. Now, this is a combination both of unemployment and just people who are outside the workforce, disability or other types of things. But that's a big number. You know, one third of men aged 25 to 54 not being working within the next 30 years. The sectors that are most likely to experience the workforce ramification are going to be the entry-level jobs, so the retail clerks, because of the Amazon experience that I just cited, truck driving because of autonomous vehicles, taxi drivers, the ride-sharing services. Just those occupations right there right now provide 12 million jobs. So that's a lot of people at risk. But it's not just going to be the entry level positions. We're seeing AI applications in healthcare. So, for example, right now, radiologists read our x rays and our CAT scans, but there are AI systems where if you feed them enough images and the images are labeled normal versus abnormal readings, after about 10,000 images, the AI can accurately read your CAT scan with about a 95% accuracy rate. Now, that's still a little less than a human radiologist, but it's not that far below. So there are going to be a lot of people affected by the technology innovation, entry-level people, middle-class people, as well as professional people. Now, there are going to be a lot of new jobs created, including new jobs that we don't even know what they are now, but certainly we're going to need data scientists. So any of the young people who are worried about finding a job in the future, like statistical knowledge, data skills, certainly programming skills, computer skills, and so on, those are going to guarantee a future. E-commerce is expanding right now. About 10% of retail sales are taking place through e-commerce platforms. Within 10 years, in the United States, that will be between 25 and 30%. So a lot of growth areas there. But the problem is going to be our possible mismatch. There could be a mismatch between the skills that American workers have today versus the skills that are going to be required in some of those new jobs. So we're tracking a kind of how the technology is unfolding across a variety of different sectors, what the possible impact is going to be. But it's not just the technology that you need to focus on, because there are two revolutions taking place simultaneously right now. One is the tech revolution that we have just talked about, but the second is equally fundamental and equally important from the standpoint of the workforce ramifications, which is the changes in business models. Capitalism has changed in recent years in the sense that large companies no longer require large workforces. Like if you go back 40 years and look at the big companies of those days, the AT&Ts, the General Motors, they were very large companies. They had 500,000 employees and 600,000 employees. Today, Facebook has a stock valuation of over 600 billion. It's probably higher by now. They only have 25,000 workers. They don't need a lot more workers than that. Facebook is actually adding human monitors because of the hate speech that is appearing on their website. But as a platform, they are never going to have 500,000 workers or anything close to it. Microsoft today has about 124,000 workers. Google has 80,000. Apple has 123,000. So all significantly lower than the big companies of 40 and 50 years ago. What companies have discovered today is you don't have to have a large workforce to be very productive and have a high stock valuation. The norm today is you switch to temporary workers, part-time workers, short-term employees, lean management practices. The sharing economy kind of encapsulates all that. And so it's the combination of the new technologies on the one hand, but the changes in the business models that are going to produce some of the profound consequences for workers. Because with the changes in the business models, we're increasingly moving towards a model of jobs without benefits, jobs without healthcare, without retirement benefits, and so on. So that is a fundamental change. And so the question that a lot of people are wondering about is, in 30 years, once all of these technologies really become much more pronounced, are we going to end up in dystopia, in which we have high unemployment, high levels of inequality, and lots of these jobs without healthcare benefits? Or are we going to end up with the possibility of utopia, meaning more leisure time, time for people to pursue their outside interests, art, culture, music, sports, theater, whatever it happens to be? Will we move towards a more inclusive economy and a more inclusive society as a result of some of the changes that are taking place? In the book, I basically argue that we control our destiny in this regard. Whether we end up in dystopia or utopia depends very much not on the technology. I am not a technology determinist, but on our policy choices and the choices we make as a society, how we think about the nature of jobs, how we define jobs, how we think about our social contract with one another. In the book, I argue that there are various ways for us to solve possible joblessness that may come out of the new technologies, in the sense that we can reimagine jobs, we can redefine jobs. There are lots of things that are socially beneficial today for communities all across the country that don't count as jobs. This includes parenting, volunteer activities, caretaking activities, taking care of the young, taking care of the old, and community service projects. We don't define any of those as jobs. You don't qualify for social benefits based on them. And by the way, other countries are starting to move in this direction. The United Kingdom, for example, has a pilot project where people can qualify for social benefits based on recognized community service projects. So that's a model that we could consider. But I think the most important thing is really the public policy angle here. And we need to think about ways to renegotiate our social contract with one another. In the book, I argue that we need to think about making benefits more portable, because one of the likely features of the emerging digital economy is what we call job churn. People moving from job to job, company to company, and even sector to sector. In my adult lifetime, I've been very fortunate. I've had two jobs, Brown University and the Brookings Institution. Great jobs. Like, I consider myself the luckiest person in the world. When I talk to young people, I tell them that is not going to be their lives. They're going to have 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 different jobs at various points in their lives. We're going to have to engage in what we call lifetime learning. The old model, where you invest in education up through about age 25, and then after that, you go into the workforce and don't have to worry about this. That is not going to be the model going forward. People are going to have to regularly update their job skills at age 30, 40, 50, and 60. So those of you who are young, getting a great education at Brown, that's a great platform on which to build your education, but don't think that you're going to be able to stop with a BA, an MA, or an even higher degree from Brown University. You're going to need new job skills because the workforce is going to change, the nature of jobs are going to change. the way in which we think about jobs are going to change. In the book, I suggest that we're going to need something that I call citizen learning accounts, kind of modeled after IRAs, where people can invest money in those accounts. Companies, if you're with a progressive company, would match that money. And then as you need job retraining or skill upgrading, you will have money to draw on that. But we're going to have to think about how to finance lifetime learning. In the fall, I spoke to the National Governors Association that was meeting in Columbus, Ohio, and I was on a panel with the CEO of Udacity, which is one of the major online learning platforms. And the CEO made a prediction, which I don't know if he is right in the exact magnitude of what he said, but he is certainly right in the direction of what he said. He predicted that within 10 years, the adult education market would be as big as the higher education market is today. Meaning that when you kind of think about conventional higher education, the community colleges, the four-year schools, and the graduate programs, that in the future, people needing and desiring adult education, worker retraining, and job reskilling, that market is going to be as big as what we today think of as the higher education market. So he obviously is betting his company on that future, but he argues that basically job reskilling is going to be a big part of what we need to do. So in the book, I suggest a lot of policy reforms that I think would move us closer to helping workers make the adjustment to the digital economy. But the biggest concern I have is actually not the policy piece, because I think there are lots of ways we can handle this adjustment to the digital economy. I think the bigger challenge is really the governance challenge and the political challenge. Is our politics currently up to the task of this very substantial transition to a digital economy? We all know the answer to that. The answer is no. We can see the gridlock in Washington, the polarization in our political system, just the inability to have rational discussions about major issues. We simply are not at that point. In the book, I argue that Trumpism is not an aberration, that Trumpism is going to outlast Donald Trump. We may get rid of Donald Trump in the 2020 election, but Trumpism is going to be here, it's going to stay here, and it actually could intensify over the next 10, 20, and 30 years as these technology changes unfold and as the changes in business models start to affect people. If anything, I think candidate Trump underestimated the scope of the problem, because if you think back to the 2016 election, his diagnosis of our economic problem was lost manufacturing jobs and bad trade deals. And he spent a lot of the last 2 years trying to address those issues. In my view, the problem is much more fundamental and actually a lot bigger than what he said, because it's the changes in the technology, the automation, and the business model shifts. The anxiety associated with these technology changes is going to be quite profound. You can actually look at public opinion surveys today. We've done some at Brookings. Other people have been measuring this as well. It's like people are anxious about these changes. They're worried about the issue of whether robots are going to take your jobs. They're worried about those entry-level workers. Like, what are they going to do? Those are people with a high school education, or sometimes even less than a high school education. Like, they're not going to become data scientists. They're not going to become computer programmers. What are we going to do about those individuals? The other thing that is going to complicate our future is the mismatch between our economic output and our geography. My Metro colleagues at Brookings did a study, and they found 15% of U.S. counties today generate 64% of our GDP. So think about that. 15% of the counties generate 64% of the GDP. What that means in practical terms is most of our economic activity is on the East Coast, the West Coast, and then a few metropolitan areas in between. Large parts of the country are being left behind. Trump was exactly right in 2016 when he made that argument and told many Americans that they've been left behind, the system is rigged against them, and the system is unfair. And so the anxiety associated with the technology changes, the mismatch in terms of geography and the strong geographic disparities that we face are going to be with us regardless of whether there is a Trump presidency. And so we need to anticipate a future, at least in the next 10 years and probably in the next 20 years, where populism is going to be a real concern. It's going to be a real issue in American politics, but it's not necessarily just going to be right-wing populism. In the 2020 election, we will also see left-wing populism. It's interesting to me in studying some of the Democratic candidates so far. Many of them actually are echoing the language of candidate Trump from 2016. They are telling Americans the system is rigged against you, it's unfair, you're not doing well, and the whole system is basically a nightmare for you. But then they are going on to suggest liberal remedies to those problems, very different from the remedies that candidate Trump and now President Trump is pursuing. So it's a wealth tax, Medicare for all, free college, liberal solutions, but to the very same problems that Trump has talked about. So I think, we could see a future where we're alternating between real extremes, right-wing nationalists of the type that Trump represents, but also left-wing progressives who pursue equally strong and, in some cases, extreme versions of those policies. Now, this is not the first time we have dealt with mega change in American history. 100 years ago, we had an equally fundamental shift from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. When you look at the period from roughly the 1890s through the 1930s, it was a very difficult time period. A lot of chaos, a lot of turbulence, a lot of political disarray. There was violence, workers on the front lines getting shot when they were trying to make changes in their businesses. But how did we respond? It took decades to work through the policy answers or the policy responses to industrialization, but we actually made a number of policy changes as well as governance changes. On the policy front, we developed Social Security, unemployment insurance. We broke up the monopolies, which at that time were the railroads and Standard Oil. We added an income tax to the Constitution, but there were a number of political reforms designed to improve our governance capacity. Because before we made certain changes, our government system, like at the turn of the 20th century, was terrible, completely corrupt, inefficient. In fact, Brookings was founded in 1916 by a St. Louis businessman who was upset with the corruption and inefficiency of government. I feel a little badly that it's now 103 years later and we face some of the same problems. It makes you wonder what the hell we've been doing for the last century. But at that time, we enacted a number of governance and political reforms designed to improve our ability to solve problems. So party bosses were seen as a big barrier to innovation at that time. So we developed primaries as a means to bypass the bosses at election time. Referendum were a progressive reform designed to give people a direct say in making a policy. If Wendy Schiller were here, she would be very aware of this history. We had a constitutional amendment to change senators from being chosen by state legislatures, which is how it was specified in the Constitution, to direct election of senators, again, to bring more democracy to the process. We added a constitution to the amendment to double the size of the electorate in 1920 when women earned the right to vote. We moved towards mass education, which at that time meant encouraging people to get a high school education, and then eventually we encouraged them to get a college education. So there were a lot of policy and governance changes that we made in order to put our country in a stronger position to handle those structural changes, the impact of industrialization, people who are being left behind, people who needed retraining. Like we enacted concrete things that address those problems. And you know what? It actually worked pretty well. It's not like we solved every problem in the United States, but the United States emerged out of that in a strong position and became a global leader. So in the book, I argue that today, when we're moving from an industrial to a digital economy, it's an equally fundamental shift, and we're going to need equally fundamental reforms. policy reforms as well as governance reforms. In order to improve governance, we have to get rid of the Electoral College. We've had 2 elections in 16 years where the popular vote winner did not win the Electoral College. With the geographic disparities that I noted earlier, that could actually start to happen on a regular basis. And if that starts happening all the time, that's a constitutional crisis. We need to think about the problem of the US Senate in the sense that we may shortly end up in a situation where 15 states generate much of America's economic activity. And so the prosperous parts of America will have 30 senators, and the not very prosperous parts will have 70 senators. Think about what that means. That's populism on steroids, because the people in those 35 states are really going to be upset. Like if we think, Trump was able to appeal to populist instincts, scapegoat, blame people for our current economic problems, like future presidents will do that probably to an even greater degree. So we need to think about fundamental changes in our political system. In the book, I suggest an idea from Australia called universal voting, because polarization is a huge problem in our political system today, that when you have relatively low turnout elections, politicians from both parties have clear incentives to play to the extremes. We have seen it on the Republican side in the 2020 election. We will see that on the Democratic side. If we can adopt universal voting, which is basically you have to vote, and it's like a parking ticket violation if you don't, like you pay a $25 or $30 fine. Countries that have that typically have a 90 to 95% turnout. That changes the incentives for politicians. In that situation, it's less likely for them to play to the extremes and more likely for them to play to the center of the American political spectrum and the moderate part of the system. So I think that we have to think big today. This is not an era for incrementalism, and Trump actually understands that. He proposes a lot of crazy, but he's thinking big. He's thinking big from a nationalist standpoint. The rest of us need to think big from other political stances. I think the biggest challenge we're going to face, though, is going to be cultural in nature, because America basically has a long history of individualism, where each person is responsible for him or herself. If you do well, it's because you're smart, you're hardworking, you went to Brown University, got a great education, and you end up going out and doing very well. Conversely, if you're not doing so well, you're poor, you're lazy, you don't work hard, you didn't get a good education, it's basically your fault. Like, American individualism colors a lot of our thinking about the United States, colors our public policies, kind of explains why the United States ended up on a different track compared to Western European countries. For the era that is coming, I argue we're going to need more of a sense of solidarity. We're going to need less individualism and more of a sense that we're in it together. There are going to be people who are smart, hardworking, and well-educated who don't have jobs or who are underemployed in their jobs. It's not going to be their fault. It's going to be because the technology change, the changes in business models, and if we don't update our policies, policy barriers to the transition to the digital economy. We're going to need more of a sense of solidarity, that we're in it together, and that if you're not doing well, that's going to have consequences for me, and so therefore I should worry about it. Like, we can look around the world and see societies that have 20 and 30% youth unemployment rates. Those societies are a complete disaster. Violence, unrest, political protest, leaders almost always end up resorting to authoritarianism to control the population. So it's in all of our self-interest to think in a more of a sense of social solidarity, because I think we're going to need it as some of these changes start to unfold. I want to close on an optimistic note. People sometimes have told me my book is a little scary for them. Although I tell them when I've given talks, I often tell audiences, I can do optimism or I can do pessimism. Tell me what you want, and I can give you a persuasive argument. I'm going to close with an optimistic argument here. Because there actually is a way in which we may work through this transition in a way that's calm, peaceful, gradual, and actually works out fine, and we end up much closer to the utopian end as opposed to the dystopian end. And basically, the note of optimism concerns the millennial generation, many of the young people who are here in this room today. We actually study young people. We know quite a bit about them through survey evidence. What do the surveys tell us? Young people do not want the society or the economy that my generation has had and that my generation has helped to create. They want a better work-life balance. They see older people who've worked too hard and not taken time to enjoy other things. Young people have outside interests that they want to pursue, leisure time activities, hobbies, sports, art, culture, music, theater. They have community service interests. There are ways they want to contribute to society. Mentoring immigrants, helping poor people, and so on. Surveys also demonstrate that at least right now, most young people are more progressive in their views, and they want a more inclusive society. And so many of the things that I talk about in the book, I will grant you right now have zero chance of being implemented in the next 2 years, the next 4 years, and probably even longer than that. I didn't write the book for the next few years. I wrote the book for the period from 2020 to 2050. Because we have 30 years to get this right. By 2050, the world is going to be dominated by all the technologies that I have talked about. Autonomous vehicles will be ubiquitous. Robots will be manufacturing all the things in factories. There'll be lots of automation in entry-level jobs and so on. We have 30 years to get this right. If we start to make the changes now, it will be easy. The longer we wait, the bigger and the more disruptive the changes will be, and the harder it will be to do that. We may get lucky that as the millennials age and move into leadership positions, that there will be a more gradual evolution in the sense that their values will become our society's values, and that it will be easier to do the types of things that at least I think we will need to do in order to do well. So if that scenario holds, that's the optimistic scenario, that young people will be our saviors, and we will voluntarily make the changes that we're going to need to make in this transition to the digital economy. Why don't I stop at that point? I'd be happy to take questions, hear any comments. If you want to argue, I have lots of experience arguing with Brown University faculty and students. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to start with some questions, and I love the big bold ideas that you've laid out in the book as we think about 20 or 30 years from now. But what do we do tomorrow, right? Are there any micro level things that we could be doing, maybe on a regulatory level, that you see is not interfering with the 20-year, 30-year plan, but that could help us get there?
The tomorrow question, there are incremental policies that will definitely move us closer in the direction where we need. So, for example, one current policy that is generally acknowledged as being a very successful public policy and a very successful social welfare policy is the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a way to basically help people who have been in the labor market but are out and are not doing well. It's basically a way to give them money. So it's well short of the universal basic income that a lot of people are talking about, but it's a small scale version of that. It's our current policy. We have that in the tax code. People use it when they're filing their taxes. There's a problem with it, though. We could fine tune it in the sense that now the Earned Income Tax Credit comes once a year. You basically have to be in the labor force, file taxes because you've earned income, and then qualify for this tax credit and then get money back. There are pilot projects that have moved that to a quarterly basis as opposed to an annual basis. that is a big help to people. Like studies have found that that provides more income security for people because it's not a once a year thing. I think doing it on a monthly basis would be even better than a quarterly basis. So there are small scale incremental refinements of current policies that I think would make a difference. We certainly have to look at our tax policies, which seem completely unfair now, and too many of the tax benefits are going to the top 1% and not to the middle class that actually needs the help. So if I were focusing just on tomorrow and let's say the 2020 election, like those are the types of things I would talk about. Although it's interesting, several of the Democratic candidates already have come out in favor of some of the bigger ideas, like getting rid of the Electoral College, and even Elizabeth Warren has talked about a wealth tax, which of course is a big idea, but very contentious as well.
And as we think about where do we go from here, what do you see as some of the roles and responsibilities of research universities like Brown and the Brookings Institution? How can we be helpful in the transformations that lie ahead?
I think the biggest problem I see in the United States is we're not really devoting enough time to even talking about this issue. So one thing that we're definitely trying to do at Brookings, and I would certainly encourage people at Brown and other places, other universities around the country to do, is just to spend more time thinking about these issues, debating these issues, and proposing policy solutions. And obviously, there are going to be a wide range of solutions that people come up with, and we're going to have big arguments over them, but we need to be having those conversations. I've gone to a few conferences in Europe over the last couple years, and especially since my book came out last year. I found that several of those countries are well ahead of us, one, in basically saying, yeah, there's a freight train coming down the tracks, and we need to be realistic in recognizing that and thinking about how to change our policies in response to that. They're ahead of us in thinking about it. I think several of those countries have more of a sense of solidarity in their cultures, so it's going to be an easier transition for them. I think the United States, among advanced industrial countries, could have the rockiest transition just because of our lack of solidarity in our culture and our sense of individualism. I just don't think that's going to serve us well. So anything that all of us in the knowledge area can do just to start talking about these issues, to focus public attention, to demand answers from our candidates in 2020, like how they're going to deal with these issues, like those are the things we should be focusing on.
Well, let's take some of your questions. I think we have some microphones. Yes, in the back.
Nice to see you.
I see you at church, or I used to when you were in Providence. I love what you said about how Trump thinks big, because that's what I like about AOC. I don't really give a hoot if her ideas necessarily become law, but what I like about her is her ability to stand up and be bold and to think outside of the box and to give wide, interesting policy solutions for our country. I think you're right when you say that we're all tired of incrementalism, even though we all studied in our books that incrementalism is the way back when. So your thoughts on AOC, and it's nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you, and thanks for coming out. That's a great question. I do think we are seeing new members of Congress and some members, some presidential candidates who are rising to the challenge in the sense of understanding there's a big problem and that we need to think big in response to them. I don't necessarily agree with all the ideas that are coming up with and some of the things that AOC is talking about, but I encourage basically a diversity of views just so we can start having these debates, because it's going to take a while. If you think back again 100 years ago, like how long it took us from when we started talking about it to when we actually had Social Security, how long it took women to get the right to vote, how long it took to get the income tax, which initially passed Congress, the Supreme Court invalidated it, and then we had to add an amendment to the Constitution to authorize the income tax. Like a lot of those debates took 20 and 30 years. So, like, we're not going to solve these problems in the next 2 years, the next 4 years, the next 6 years, probably even the next 10 years, but it may take 20 years or more to get to the point where we do have the solution. We have to start those conversations today to get to that point.
Darrell, I wanted to ask a question about your characterization that politics is at two extremes right now, and that it would be better if we had a politics that came from the center. And I wonder if that's the wrong way to look at it, because if you're talking about big ideas, you're going to have ideas that are on the extremes. And maybe a different way to characterize our current time in keeping with the way that you characterize the earlier era is that there's a backward-looking way to think about politics and one that is more forward-looking. And I have to say, I mean, that sounds tendentious to say it, but it does seem to me that the kind of approach that Trump has extremely backward-looking. Let's close the country's borders. Let's just pretend it's all white people. Let's pretend that jobs aren't going away and we can recreate some mythical version. And so I don't see it seems to me that what you call the extremism on the left is forward looking. And, all the ideas may not be right, and I once worked at Brookings too, and I know that Brookings loves the center, but I just wonder if that's the right way to think about the current political climate that we're in, and aren't we really going to be in a place of polarization, and it may be necessary.
That's a very good point. And in my new book on divided politics, which talks about polarization, I kind of explore some of these themes. It is certainly possible. There are alternative ways to solve this problem. So one would be centrist solutions where the country comes together. But an alternative one, which is the one you suggest, is one side wins, and it happens to be the progressive side, which after the Great Depression, that's kind of what happened. Like the New Deal, Social Security, a lot of the social reforms, and the rise of the administrative state came because one side won. And if that is the way we resolve that, and it's progressive ideas that get implemented, I'd be perfectly fine with that. I think the limiting factor on that is going to be our current institutional structures, like the idea of one side winning when you have the Electoral College, and it's going to be possible for the political minority to win the presidency, even if they lose the popular vote. That's a big problem. Gerrymandering, like I think Democrats in Wisconsin had to, in the state legislature, had to win 55 to 45 to get a bare majority. And so there are lots of ways in which our current system is not going to produce a winning side for progressives. The 60 vote requirement to break filibusters in the Senate, is another way in which, let's say I think it's very possible after the 2020 election, we're going to have a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, if for no other reason than the backlash against Trump and his policies. But if Democrats don't get 60 votes in the Senate, and they probably will need a few more than 60 because there will be a few members of Democrats that are not going to vote for progressive legislation, Mitch McConnell is going to be sitting there, and we know exactly what he's going to do. It's the same thing he did with Obama. So the ability of one side to win is a possible scenario, but with our current institutional arrangements, it just doesn't strike me as likely. Now, if we can make governance changes that remove these institutional barriers, then it's a different picture. But there would be a lot of work involved in doing that.
Hey, Darrell. So I actually also worked at Brookings for a little while as an intern for Mark Muro.
Yep.
And I got to ask a similar question then, and I kind of wanted to rephrase it, which is a lot of the framing about the debate about the future of work seems to stem from this notion that artificial intelligence is uniquely different from previous technologies in the way that it displaces labor. And it doesn't, some of the research I've seen seems to suggest that that's not necessarily true, but it does pose a threat of, the skills divergence, job polarization, and the shrinking of the middle class, which seems pretty much in line with trends that we've seen since the 70s. So I'm just wondering, given that we know that income inequality tends to be a pretty bad thing when it reaches a high level, shouldn't we be more worried about inequality than we are about the future of work?
Well, I see the two as related because current work patterns are reinforcing income inequality, and technology seems to be widening the income inequality. And so as technology starts to kick in, the fear is that income inequality is actually going to get worse before it gets better. If you look just on a geographic basis, and I'm sure when you worked with Mark, you paid attention to this part of it. 3/4 of the current venture capital money goes to 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. Venture capital money is a predictor of how the economy is going to develop because that's where the private sector is investing the money. The geographic disparities that we're talking about, which contribute to the high income equality, it's going to get worse just because the money is being concentrated literally on a handful of states on the East Coast and the West Coast. I mean, when Amazon was searching for its second headquarters, its initial decision was New York and Washington, D.C. And I thought, this is terrible. Like, this is like the worst thing for our country because I would have been much more pleased if Amazon had chose Indianapolis or Kansas City or Austin or Denver or anywhere in the heartland. And of course, all those cities wanted that second headquarters, but what do? They reinforce existing patterns. So my concern about the future of work patterns is we already have high income inequality. Technology is probably going to make it worse. The venture capital investments are definitely going to make it worse. And the way we've dealt with that in the past has been through policy remedies to reduce inequality. We're not doing that. I mean, the last 2 years, we've made the wrong policy choices. So those are the things that I worry about.
Hi, thanks a lot for coming to speak on this today. You mentioned the need for a future emphasis on continuing education and workforce development. So I have a two-part question on that. The first stems from the fact that I think currently workforce development is often driven by private sector employers or public-private partnerships between state, local, federal governments and those private sector employers. And it seems to be increasingly trending that way. I'm wondering how you think this balance will shift. And then following on that, as the emphasis of continuing education and workforce development, especially when it is connected to private sector employers, is increasingly utilitarian, right? Probably correctly, based on getting people the skills they need to enter a job and then getting them there as quickly as possible. How do you think the incursion of the private sector into the educational space will comport with your vision of sort of more arts and leisure and things like that, as you outlined in your, I think you called it your optimistic view?
I think that does raise interesting questions because I would agree that a lot of the private sector job retraining programs, workforce development, and kind of adult education in general is pretty short term in what it's trying to do. It's trying to teach people a concrete job skill to get a job, 6 months down the road. In a world where the economy and the workforce needs are going to change pretty substantially over a short period of time, that may not be the right approach. I would not necessarily advocate a liberal arts approach to workforce development, but we may need something other than, I'm going to train you to code Python. It may need to be broader in order to be helpful to the person. Like that skill might allow you to get the next job, but then 2 years, 5 years, or 7 years down the road, you may end up unemployed again and kind of in the same situation. God, I thought I was completely clear in my presentation, but there's so many questions.
Hi, Darrell.
Hey, Marion, how are you?
Can you say something about race? I saw a list by the Joint Center for Economic Studies, and it listed the kind of jobs that would be targeted for AI or artificial intelligence, and it showed that a lot of Black folk were in these jobs. Can you say something about that at all?
I mean, there certainly have been some efforts to diversify those jobs. I'd be interested in seeing that study because there is evidence that diversity is a huge problem in the technology sector in general, and I'd be surprised if AI did not reflect that type of inequity. But we do need to think about the disparate impact on various groups within American society. Like even today, when like our national unemployment rate is 4% or a little bit less than 4%, the unemployment rate among young African-American men is about 30%. So that's at a time of a good economy. What happens if we have these workforce dislocations? Like, how's it going to affect that particular group? Like, their unemployment rate could become 50%, and that becomes a real problem. We do need to pay attention to the racial disparities and how technology could make those things worse. So that's definitely an important consideration.
Thank you. So you talked about the American society and how it was going to be impacted by AI in the future, but I'm thinking about how luckily the US still has a lot of social benefits despite the many problems that the country is facing recently. But a lot of countries around the world do not have the social benefits, do not have politicians that care about their well-being, do not have institutions that try to improve the standards of living. So I'm mostly thinking of the global South countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, indeed. So I was thinking, how do you think AI will impact these countries in the future? Because I think the larger workforce in the world is now concentrated in these countries, and they are definitely the ones, the populations that will be affected the most strongly by the development of AI. And I know we're focusing on American politics and policy right now, but I still think we live in a globalized world, and despite AI being developed in the US, it will definitely impact the global South and those developing countries.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right to raise the global ramifications of all this, because this definitely is not just a U.S. story, even though I have focused on that in this talk. The global consequences are going to be profound, probably in the direction of widening inequality, not just within the United States, but across countries. So the countries that have the technology are going to be in a stronger position than countries that do not have the technology, because the technology can boost economic growth without producing jobs. Like that's kind of been the pattern that we've seen in recent years. So the United States could continue to be a very prosperous country just with a lot of income inequality and people who are either unemployed or underemployed. In other countries, they may not have the jobs or the prosperity, which is much worse than our situation. And as you point out, they don't have the social safety net that we have to cushion some of the impact here. So I've given talks in a number of places around the world. Every country is worrying about this. Like they can see the technology innovation taking place. They're trying to figure out what it means for them. The country that is probably doing I hesitate to say the best job, but they're putting the most planning into this is China, because the two leading countries now on AI innovation is China and the United States. Like Europe is far behind, and Russia is really far behind, and the rest of the world is even further behind. China is investing $150 billion in AI with the goal of becoming the global leader by 2030. And so they're kind of see this as the catalyst for economic growth on their part. But you're right, the global South suffers already. They're likely to suffer more as technology innovation kicks in.
You've spoken a lot about the effect of AI and robotics and so forth on the 30% of the country that produces the bulk of the wealth, the bulk of the knowledge, the bulk of the material goods. Say something about the effect on the rural areas of America. Are we Can we look forward to getting rid of farmers? Are they going to be wandering around like the Okies during the Dust Bowl? And what are the implications, for example, for the vast numbers of unskilled immigrants who come to actually pick the crops if you essentially replace them by robotics?
I go back to my rural roots about once a year, and it's amazing how agriculture has become corporatized during this time period. I think agriculture, in terms of the workforce, is now less than uh, uh, 2 million people. And so basically, as an employer, that sector has basically been devastated. And as you point out, it's so hard to get people to work on the farms, which I completely understand, having done a lot of those things when I was growing up. We really need immigration in order to address that worker shortage. That's an area where we need additional workers, and native-born Americans don't want to do that. And so, in a situation where the current administration is trying to crack down on immigration, some of the parts of the economy that's being hit the hardest is the service sector, the hotel industries, the restaurant industries, but also farmers, because they need those workers. And if they don't have immigrants, like native-born Americans are not going to do those jobs.
But could you say what prospects are for replacing them, or they will be moved to eliminate those jobs?
There's definitely a lot of automation that's coming into agriculture. There's a field called precision agriculture, which is basically applying different technology solutions to agriculture. So, for example, one growth area is using sensors so you can measure the temperature and moisture level of the soil, so you know when the best time is to plant stuff. I think I'd be surprised if robots were able to do some of the jobs that require more handwork, like picking strawberries. I did a talk at Google X last year, I think it was, and they are spending a lot of time now on robotics. The biggest challenge they have is not moving robots around. Like, we actually have mastered that technology pretty well. The hardest robot challenge that they described to me is the hand movement of picking up items. And of course, they're mostly focused on warehouses, because in a warehouse, there might be 50,000 different products of differing sizes, compositions, textures, and so on. We don't have robots that we can develop robots that can learn how to pick up a box, but you can't train a robot yet to learn, of the 25,000 items I need to pick up, like, this is the one and this is how I do it. And strawberries are basically in the same category. So I don't see a lot of prospects for robots solving that particular challenge, but there will be ways in which technology will help agriculture.
You spoke a lot about the long-term view on politics and how policies over the next 30 years need to address these challenges. How do you reconcile your optimism with global climate change, deforestation, habitat loss, all of these sort of irreversible effects that have shortening timelines for permanent harm to our society?
Well, I'm less optimistic about our ability to address those issues, and we seem to have an even shorter time period to make meaningful steps there. So obviously, that is a big problem. That could trump all these other issues ultimately. But if you play that out, and if you assume that climate change is advancing, water levels are going to come up, like, in virtually every country around the world, the major cities are on an ocean, a lake, or a river. Most of our power plants are built right next to water sources, for cooling purposes. And so we have to worry about the political destabilization and the economic destabilization that's going to emerge from climate change. If that happens on top of all the stuff I've been talking about, technology changes, business model changes, and so on, it's like there's no basis for optimism in that scenario.
Hi. I just want to talk about a couple things that you mentioned. So I see a lot of parallels with the current tech climate, with a lot of older fields like oil, and I'm just wondering, so you said that this is accelerating at a very fast rate, and I think that we kind of all think that like the society can rebound with the problems that AI and technological advancements are, the effects of them. I think that if you look at like cases like Cambridge Analytica, a lot of data privacy issues, these things are happening because government has been too late to regulate them. Um, the same thing has happened with, I would imagine, with oil, with like antitrust situations. You mentioned in your talk that it took 20, 30 years to really put in the regulations that we wanted to see, to improve these societal issues. I mean, is there a possibility that, I think, especially uniquely with AI, that advancements in AI will actually outrun the American political system to the point that we have a dystopian future where there are companies like Facebook and Google, which basically have more powerful than they have more power than the actual governments that are regulating them. I mean, is it possible that we will outrun the law? And how do we prevent that? What's going to happen?
Yes, that is a possibility. I mean, Facebook today is a sovereign nation of 2 billion people. But the thing that runs in the opposite direction is there is a growing techlash to all these technology developments. I mean, you can look at the survey evidence. Facebook as a company has dropped 30 to 40 percentage points on favorability towards it. People used to like Facebook. Today, people don't like it and don't trust it. We see the same thing in terms of other digital technologies as well. America has been very libertarian in its general approach to the technology sector, because 30 years ago, when digital technology started to come around, people said, well, wow, there's great potential here. We don't really know how to regulate it, so let's just let them do their thing and we'll see how it goes. And it's now 30 years later, and we actually are starting to see more efforts at regulation and more successful efforts at regulation. Not necessarily at the national level, but we're definitely seeing it at the state level. Like California just passed a pretty tough privacy law, not quite as tough as the EU GDPR regulations, but much closer to that than what has been the case in the United States. Most of the digital platforms based on the 1996 Telecommunications Act were exempted from legal liability. So if bad things happen on your platform, we cannot sue them for their platform. We're starting to change that. Just last year, Congress passed legislation allowing lawsuits against platforms that enable human trafficking and youth child molestation. And so the signs are definitely there that we no longer feel the tech sector is special and therefore exempt from regulation. We're starting to move more in the direction of treating it like other sectors, and there are good things that come out of the technology, and there clearly are a number of bad things, and we're starting to regulate the bad things. That is probably going to accelerate in coming years, and you're going to see, I mean, already in the 2020 presidential campaign, there are a number of candidates that have come out with positions on the tech sector much stronger than anything we've seen in recent years.
Hi. So I heard you talk about like sort of the Midwest and South not receiving proportionate wealth or investment, and I was just curious, like, do you think there's something morally wrong with the Midwest not receiving as much wealth or investment as the East Coast or the West Coast? Is there something morally wrong about Utah not getting the venture capitalism that New York is receiving? Or is your concern primarily with political unrest and populism?
I wouldn't say it's morally wrong, but it's economically wrong in the sense that it's unfair for there to be the kind of geographic disparities that we see in a political system based on geographic representation. It's really the combination of the geographic disparities and the way our political institutions are structured that create the problem, which lead to a populist backlash of ultranationalism, which has been the initial response to that. So that is what concerns me. It just seems like if those types of inequities widen, the populist response is going to intensify, and the risk of bad policy decisions goes up pretty dramatically.
In front.
Just kind of a follow up on that previous question. I'm going to add another question as well. Why is your concern necessarily the backlash as opposed to like the fundamental issue that caused that kind of addiction, the issue of the inequality? It seems to kind of be like almost a class dynamic, as opposed you're more concerned about what working class people might respond to as opposed to their conditions. And also, do you think that a kind of fairer and potentially more sustainable solution to these issues would be treating these technologies almost like a public utility in a sense? So treating AI or maybe like 3D printing, things of that nature as a utility that people have in their communities, public libraries, or even in their own houses, to kind of be a counterbalance to the private sector and to Facebook and, like you said, a 2 billion person sovereign country. So kind of like a two-part question there.
I think on the regulatory question, we are moving in that direction, especially for the companies that either have monopoly power or near monopoly power, which is several of them at this point in time. That when you have that type of market concentration, market forces aren't going to protect us, and so therefore government regulation is going to be required. On the first part of your question, income inequality is a big problem, and that is what's driving a lot of different issues, the political backlash, but also the lack of economic opportunity. A few years ago, I published a book called Billionaires, and drew on some UC Berkeley income data that economists had collected on the percent of the national income that the top 1% have gotten each year over the last 100 years. And the chart basically shows that, if you go back to 1920s, 1930s, the top 1% had more than 20% of the national income. It then dropped to a low point of 8% in 1976. And then, of course, since then, it's gone back up to over 20%. When I saw those data, the data amazed me, because it turns out the most egalitarian point in American history was 1976, which happened to be the year that I graduated from college. And of course, at that time, I had no idea that I was graduating at the most egalitarian point, and that I've had many opportunities in my life. And I used to think it was because of me. And now I understand the structural situation was great. And I look at my nieces and nephews who grew up in the same community as I did, attended the same schools, et cetera, and they've struggled economically. Like, the structural situation has been a lot worse for them. Education costs more, healthcare costs more, buying first home costs more. It's like everything is more difficult. So inequality is a huge problem today, and we have to worry about it because it could get worse. And we just see the economic consequences and the political consequences and the community consequences that come from that.
In the back here.
First of all, thank you for coming today. Great talk. My question is essentially two parts. The first part is going back to the global arena and kind of reiterating the previous question that was asked about the income equality that's going to be created with the technological advancements, and especially in the countries in the West and countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia falling behind. And these countries, at this point, for example, Turkey has about 14% unemployment, whereas America's is less than 4%. And that is going to grow. How do you think the almost a colonial imperialistic structure of the West is going to play into this technological advancement? And how do you think the outsourcing of labor is going to restructure itself in order to utilize the cheaper opportunities in the East in a substitute to the workers in America? And that could take the shape of hiring coders, as is happening today. You call someone in India or in Russia, and they code something for you at a much cheaper rate than in America. And the second part of the question is, historically, we've always observed that bigger populations, stronger populations, have accumulated more wealth. But now we're entering into a human capital and more income accumulation era, where population does not necessarily correlate with wealth. And given that we know technology is going to give rise to more unemployment, we're going to have not necessarily bigger percentages, but bigger numbers of people unemployed as the population grows. How do you think that is going to be dealt with in the future, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now? Do you think universal basic income is a possible, that it is currently being debated for the elections in 2020? Do you think that has any possibility of taking into effect in the next decade? And how would that play out?
On the universal basic income, I do talk about that in the book, and it's one of the ideas among many that we should be discussing. I'd like to see some pilot projects to develop data on there are a few communities that have adopted it, and I'd like to see how it affects people. Does it improve income security? Does it improve economic security, and so on? The one time the basic income has been on the ballot was a couple years ago in Switzerland, and it lost 75 to 25%. So, a clear-cut defeat. And all of the arguments that opponents used against it were the classic of, you give people $1,000 a month, they're going to get lazy, they won't work, blah, blah, blah. And so it was very hard to sell that argument politically. And I can imagine in the United States, it would be even more lopsided. So I think, there's one Democratic candidate who is focusing on that for 2020. I'd be surprised if that spread. I think the other candidates are worried about economic disparities and worried about income inequality, but they're choosing to address it through other remedies. So Senator Warren is focusing on the wealth tax, has some arguments in terms of corporate governance. So I think more of the conversation is going to go in that direction as opposed to Andrew Yang's approach. In terms of bigger populations not necessarily becoming wealthier countries, to the extent that that becomes the model going forward, that's just a recipe for social instability. Like if you have large populations with high unemployment and limited wealth, like that's a bad formula. So to the extent that technology encourages that scenario, that's a very bad scenario. On the first part of your question, in terms of the global social contract, like globalization was kind of the deal that you suggested, that America outsourced jobs to cheaper venues. They made products less expensively, and we got cheap consumer goods. That was the social contract. And now there's a backlash in many places around the world against that deal. So that deal, I don't know what regime will replace that, but that current deal doesn't seem to be acceptable to people.
I have a question way in the back.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
Hi, Darrell. Welcome back to Brown. Sorry
Thank you.
I walked in late. Struck by you describe a radically transformed technological future, but your communication method is old school, books and lectures. So I've wondered if you've had any thoughts on, apparently reading your 23 books. So That's a lot. Very few of us can even come close to that. But is this future you envision also transform the traditional mediums of communication?
Absolutely. The world in your lifetime is going to move from text to video. I mean, we already are seeing it, and we especially see it among young people, but that is likely to accelerate. And so at Brookings, we still write books, we still write long policy reports, but increasingly we are moving towards short videos, data visualization, charts and graphs that illustrate points that we want to make, blog posts that summarize the longer paper, but with a link to the longer paper. So if people want more detail, they have that. Our web metrics suggest that 90% of our readership wants the shorter version, and only 10% are clicking through the blog to the longer paper. So that's how our audience is starting to migrate. So I think for the really young people in the crowd, if you're thinking about the knowledge industry as your future, you are going to have to think about new means of communication, because the world is changing, your generation is changing, the way that you acquire information in other parts of the world are changing, and ultimately that's going to affect us. People work in think tanks, people work in universities in terms of how we put our ideas out there. I write books because I like writing them, and I love seeing them on the shelf. But I mean, there actually is, right now, there still is a market for books. I mean, you know that your books have done very well. And the funny thing about Trump is, it's like newspaper readership is up. Our think tank readership is up 40% over last year. People want more detailed substance now. I haven't checked book sales, but I'm pretty sure I talked with a publisher just a couple of days ago. He said his books were doing really well. So in the short run, this is not a problem, and Trump may actually help in this regard. But if you're talking 10 and 20 years down the road, it's like video, web interactives, data visualization, like that's more the future of communications.
Let's take one more question, and then we'll continue the conversation out in the Agora. Yep.
Good evening. Thanks for the opportunity. I just had a question about with the proliferation of the Internet of Things and moving into the 5G network space. What do you think in regard to healthcare policy? Because obviously 5G is controversial because of the electromagnetic radiation that could cause cancer. There could be an increase in cancer rates. The Internet of Things. Is there any policies, or is there any way of looking at healthcare policy in regard to this future of the workforce, given that people need to be healthy to work?
Health is still going to be one of the growing sectors. I mean, the Internet of Things is mostly going to be based on small sensors. So, for example, in a lot of cities, people spend a lot of time circling the block trying to find the open parking place. There now are mobile apps like in Tokyo where you can basically find out where are the open parking spots in parking garages and know to go there directly. That's basically an Internet of Thing and mobile technology application, because you can have sensors at each parking place and literally have a map that shows where the open parking places are. So I'm not so worried about the health consequences there, or even with the 5G networks. But people do wonder how all this technology stuff is affecting our brains, just from a neural standpoint. Our phones, the instant gratification of instant communications, like, is that changing how we think and how we acquire information? I guess I'd be a little more worried about that part of it than the outright physical health risks.
Well, let's continue this conversation out in the foyer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.